Herzlich willkommen heute Abend im Stream, liebe Gäste. Mein Name ist René Freudenthal. Ich hoffe, Sie können mich alle gut verstehen. Wenn nicht, müssen Sie protestieren. Aus dem Kulturprogramm des Carl-Schurz-Hauses. Ich begleite Sie heute Abend ein Stück weit der Strecke durch den ersten Teil unseres Gesprächs mit J.J. Bola zu seinem erfolgreichen Sachbuch Mask of Masculinity Redefined. Zu Deutsch Sei kein Mann bei Hansa Blau. Das steht hier hinter mir. Im zweiten Teil übernehmen dann Schülerinnen und Schüler vom United World College Robert Bosch in Freiburg das Gespräch mit J.J. Bola, die sein Buch im Rahmen eines Moduls zu zeitgenössischer Männlichkeit diskutiert haben. Die Namen sind Marie, Helen und Luise. Sie werden sie im zweiten lernen. Wir freuen uns riesig, dass diese produktive Kooperation mit dem United World College zustande gekommen ist. Und natürlich, dass sich so viele von euch auch zusätzlich zu anderen Besucherinnen und Besuchern zuschalten. Ich möchte mich ganz herzlich auch bei Lydia White und Christian Bock bedanken, die eine wunderbare Kooperation mit uns unternommen haben. Und heute Abend ist sozusagen der Höhepunkt. Ja, worum geht es in diesem Buch? Wer ist der Autor, den Sie hier schon neben mir sehen? In Zeiten von Trump, MeToo und Gewaltverbrechen wie in Halle oder Hanau wird der Begriff Männlichkeit vermehrt mit Adjektiven wie toxisch, fragil und überholt zusammengebracht. Die Gender-Debatte ist in vollem Gange. Und wo der feministische Diskurs erste Erfolge zeigt, bleiben Männer manchmal in einer Geschlechterkrise zurück. Wer als Junge noch mit traditionellen Rollenmustern erzogen wurde, ist als Mann verunsichert, wenn er plötzlich sensibel sein darf oder wenn die Frau die Familie versorgt. Ob Incel-Subkultur, Machtfantasien auf Twitter oder hohe männliche Suizidraten. Männer schlagen sich buchstäblich eine Schneise durch die Krise oder finden Zuflucht in reaktionären politischen Bewegungen. In den USA stürmten Trump-Fans im Januar gewaltsam das Kapitol und übten sich in Posen als hammerharte Wikinger-Milizen. In Deutschland tobt eine neue, irgendwie auch uralte Debatte um Identitätspolitik, Gendersternchen und alte weiße Männer wie Wolfgang Thierse, die sich jetzt auch noch generell beleidigt fühlen möchten. Der britische Autor und Aktivist J.J. Bola sucht Auswege und bietet in seinem Buch zur Stunde Lösungen an, wie Männer Traumata überwinden und verlernen können, was ihnen als männlich beigebracht wurde. Dabei legt Bola historische und soziokulturelle Narrative um den Begriff der Männlichkeit frei und widerlegt populäre Mythen. Er betrachtet Einflüsse aus nicht-westlichen Traditionen, aus Popkultur und LGBTQ-Community. Er bezieht Men of Color und männliche Geflüchtete mit ein. Er zieht nach, in welchen sozialen, politischen und kulturellen Kontexten Männlichkeit, eine neue Männlichkeit, Männlichkeiten existieren können. Ob Liebe, Wettkampfsport, Rap- und Gangkultur oder psychische Gesundheit. J.J. Bola lässt keinen Lebensbereich unbeachtet. Sei kein Mann ist ein Appell an die jetzige und vor allem auch an die nächste Generation, Männlichkeit von alten Stereotypen zu befreien. Ganz kurz zur Biografie. J.J. Bola, geboren in Kinshasa im Kongo, flüchtete im Alter von 6 Jahren und wuchs in London in einer sogenannten Brennpunktsiedlung auf. Nach seinem Master in kreativem Schreiben an der Birkbeck University arbeitete er einige Jahre als Sozialarbeiter mit Jugendlichen mit psychischen Problemen. Bola engagiert sich weltweit zu Rassismus, Migrationserfahrungen und Männlichkeit. Er veröffentlichte bereits 3 Gedichtbände und einen Roman. Ein zweiter Roman, The Selfless Act of Breathing, erscheint auf Englisch im Herbst diesen Jahres. So, welcome, JJ. It's a true honor for us to have you here with us.
Thank you very much for having me. And also an extra thank you for reading my whole bio. And there was things on that I was hearing for the first time as well in another language too. So that was wonderful.
That's the German way. Like we always, the whole bio needs to be there. Like once you start winning prizes, German moderators are going to make it fun. That's like the way we do things.
Great.
So basically, what we're going to do is, for the audience as well, we're going to half this event. I'm going to cover the first half of it and talk about a few of the myths of masculinity and about politics and masculinity. Then we have a very short screen break with some material the students at UWC at the United World College have prepared. And after that, I'm going to hand off to the 3 students moderating after me about the rest of the book, basically. And then we have a short time left for Q&A from the audience. So I would like to start with one observation that kept coming to my mind. When I started reading this book, we had been surrounded basically for a year with news images of extreme soldier-like, very dangerous masculinity. We had right-wing terrorists in Germany, of course, on the streets of Hanau. We had the storming of the Capitol just this year. So what came to my mind when I read the first chapter, the title of the first chapter, which concerns myths of masculinity, what came to my mind first were like ancient myths, like Sparta and the movie 300, which some of you might know. But that's actually not really what the chapter is about. It's more about like these almost mythical assumptions that male children grow up with, basically. So I would want to know how you feel about these kind of connections between historical myths, maybe, and like these myths we basically get taught in childhood, which are more universal.
That's a really interesting question, and I think there's definitely a link there in terms of the historical myths and about masculinity particularly, and the way that we understand masculinity now. I think that in society generally, and on a local level and a global level, we don't really talk about just how deeply influenced we are by history. And when I say by history, I don't just mean history in general, but I mean the global narrative as what is presented to us as normal and widely understood, as opposed to like what are the variances. So that we know that there's a general hegemonic history that we're taught is what happened, but there's also the very local nuances and a lot of the stuff that we don't get to hear about. Like for many people, we don't really get to hear about matriarchal or matrilineal societies. That, you know, there are places around the world that still exist now where women are the heads of the household and where women choose the man that they decide to marry if they want to marry a man, and then the man comes into the home and the man prepares the home whilst the woman actually takes the more dominant role, quote unquote. And so these different historical examples help what we know and what we don't know about history actually really helps to shape the way that we see the world now, but also the way that we see ourselves. So this whole idea about kind of real men, for example, and the stoicism and the strength that comes from that, they come from historical examples such as 300, such as these kind of really archaic philosophical ideas of what it means to be a man. But it's not absolute, you know?
Yeah, actually that brought me to a comment in German National Public Radio just a few days ago, actually, who tried to comment on the same issue I tried to get to in my first question. And she also talked about like these images of soldier-like masculinity, which is suddenly back in our presence and our present so much and so frequently. And she said that masculinity has become something so political that it has to explain itself basically publicly all the time. It has to justify itself. It is no longer the unquestioned norm. And so that's something that people revolt against if they're very traditionally minded. And I was wondering, especially after reading your book, if what that leads to or might lead to, in your opinion, is that a new set of norms maybe because people like norms still and it just needs to be a better set of norms? Or do we just have to accept to live more in a state of flux, basically, of a flux of gender and of other types of societal order, basically? So is it
I think there's many things happening, but I'm going to try and narrow it to maybe like one of two, or perhaps two things maybe that are happening. So As time moves forward, we increasingly are becoming more and more aware about gender dynamics, people speaking up, about gender inequality and about such issues. And we're seeing that the once normal male-dominated patriarchal society that was unquestionably the norm, right? That dominated our lives, is no longer really being accepted as the divine truth as it once was. And so now you're seeing a lot more people, even younger people. I mean, I'm seeing like there's 15, 16-year-olds who know the word patriarchy, who are challenging gender inequality and so forth, being very vocal online in ways when I was 15 and 16, those conversations were not really being had at all, let alone understood. And so with each generation, it's like they're challenging these hierarchies and these ideals of what was considered unquestionably normal. And so when you see these power structures start to decline, what ends up happening is you'll get a group who perhaps are who double down and try harder to hold on to these kind of ideals of power that serves them. And then you'll see also on the other side that there's a shift away from that. And so it's kind of like causing a divide, if you will, between those who are in power or those who want that power and those who want a fairer, more equal world. And I think that hopefully the world that we're moving towards, especially in terms of gender, is not a world that is too dissimilar to what has existed before. There are many societies around the world, there are many examples, many which I reference in the book, where multiple genders or gender fluid, sexual fluid society was absolutely the norm, and it was accepted, and people were not treated differently because of it. So it's not an idea that requires too much imagination. It's something that we can move towards, and I think that it's about people actually understanding that this way of living that we're moving towards is something that we as human beings have already understood.
Yeah, that's so interesting that it's such a limited perspective we grew up in, basically, and I think it was always this way, it will always be this way, and that's so absolutely so far from the truth. One thing actually that struck me, maybe it's kind of a simplistic idea, but I was struck by how easily translatable the myths you comment on in this first chapter are actually translatable. Like when I've read the book in English and in German and compared, like the translations just popped into my head. Like real men is echte Männer in Germany, which sounds worse, basically. Männer weinen nicht is boys don't cry, or men don't cry. Boys don't cry is the song we all know. There's that's so gay, das ist voll schwul, and so on. And what that brought to my mind, actually, and you do such an effective job of deconstructing them that you don't even have to spell it out in a way, I think, is tell people that we basically, like, we breathe them in, like, as children, and in a way that feels harmless at first, maybe, like we just keep hearing this and we just accept it as a statement about the world, and it's so it's already so pre-configured basically by society that by the time that we have the ability to understand it, it's basically impossible without anyone else helping us to deconstruct them. So I was wondering, like, is there like any kind of, do you feel like you had like a breakthrough moment in your own education about these issues, or is it like a very slow ongoing process that you felt you had to go through?
I mean, I would say that for me, even before writing the book, and in the book, I state some of the examples that I had that were situations that kind of brought this idea of gender and masculinity right, like up front. And even afterwards, until this now, it's very much a learning process. Like, and that's how I tried to write this book. I wanted to write it from a pace of empathy and understanding and continual growth and questioning. So for me, it's not about saying that, oh, this is something that you need to learn and I already know it. Like, it's about continuing to ask questions. And for me now, even in my everyday life, I'm still asking questions about, you know, about myself, about my masculinity, about my understanding, and trying to continually move forward. And I think that hopefully creates an environment of learning and co-learning as well. And so I think that kind of like mutual understanding helps to bring us closer, rather than creating almost like, because sometimes there can be a hierarchy of learning, right? As in, I'm the person who knows, or the person with knowledge, and you're the person who doesn't know. And I think that can be quite disempowering, because, you know, we all don't have the same access to resources or to learning tools and so forth that can teach us about these things. I mean, I was quite lucky in that I grew up with parents who literally told me to read like all the time, right? Especially my dad was just like, read, read, read. And then like, I found it frustrating when I was a 12, 13-year-old boy, because I'm like, oh my gosh, it's always going to books all the time. And then I thought, you know what? Let me actually read then. Let's find out about this thing that's fascinating called reading. And then when I read for myself and learned things that I was interested in, like, it opened up my mind. But not everyone has that same access to someone, whether it's a parent, whether it's a teacher, you know, that especially in the UK, for example, a lot of libraries are being closed down and bookshops are being closed down and so forth. So access to resources is not the same for everyone. So what I try to hope for is to try to create that kind of experiential learning experience where we're both taking steps along the way and continuing to grow and learn. And, you know, I'm like, even there are some things that I read in the book where I was like, wow, you know, that's really had an impact on the way that I see myself. And it's a continual learning process. And I think that's the healthiest way to approach it. It's not just like you read the book once and you put it down and you say, oh no, I know it now. But it's like you take it with you throughout your whole life, in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, etc., however far it goes. And it's yeah, it's a journey of growth, really.
Actually, it's kind of amazing how you manage to basically communicate these ideas that are kind of abstract in some ways and complex in other ways. And it's very much not academic in a traditional way. I mean, you mentioned Judith Butler, who's like the house goddess of all of these kinds of ideas and thoughts. But it's very much reader friendly in a way. So you don't have to study Judith Butler before like dipping into this book, of course. And so one of the main ideas you take from her is this kind of gender performance, basically. So you have to perform being a man or a woman, for that matter, in some way or ways every day. And one of the basic assumptions that you comment on is being a man is being hard on yourself and being hard on lots of other people. And then this interesting double bind that's not only hard on other people who are like basically like who have to deal with that basically, but also men themselves who feel that they are still in this tradition. So can you explain, or have you explained to yourself, what keeps this double bind going generation after generation?
I mean, so even in like, just to answer that, jumping off as well the previous question, as much as it's a learning process, when you are moving forward in this journey, there is still so much to unlearn as well, right? And I'll use the example of seeking help as men, you know, whether that's in terms of mental health, in the forms of therapy, or even in terms of physical health, in terms of going to see your doctor. Like, statistics say that just men have fewer physical health checkups than women do. You know, men are more reluctant to seek help in terms of like their mental health or accessing therapy in comparison to women. And, you know, I say this as someone like I started seeing a therapist last year, and I work in mental health, and I'm someone who was always passionate and advocating for mental health, for our better mental health as well. But that was still a real challenge for me to be able to bring myself to do that. But I was able to do that with encouragement. Despite all that I know and read, it took me allowing myself to be encouraged and supported to be able to access that. And so I think it's a double-edged sword sometimes, because there's a difference between what you know, but also the way that the world responds and treats you. And we know that in spite of this, the world is still a very patriarchal place, and it rewards very patriarchal and toxic behaviors. So you're sitting on a double-edged sword in that, what do you do if the person who you truly are inside is a contrast to the world and the way that the world expects you to be? And so it's a real battle to choose to be yourself when every day you know that that could lead you into danger. And so it's this navigation, it's kind of like balancing act, this performance essentially, that you're trying to keep yourself safe in the world, but also you're trying to be authentic to who you really are and genuine. And sometimes it's really tricky. We don't always get it right, but I think awareness is the most important thing. And hopefully we continue to slowly move forwards, like in the right way.
Mm. And just to dip into the politics of this before I'll go to screen break and show a little bit of what the students of United World College have come up with. I was quite interested in how you show that political fantasies of dominance through violence, basically, which are so obvious nowadays, basically, intrinsically linked to learned masculine behavior as it stands today. And they lead to authoritarian kinds of leadership instead of democracy, maybe. They lead to the logic of war, which is quite shocking how you make that clear, instead of diplomacy. And yet you explain that the solution to this is not just to make women the leaders, but to change the framework of it. And I was wondering, of course, you have two very obvious examples and very good examples. I'll give you that. Margaret Thatcher and Theresa May, the first two UK prime ministers, female prime ministers. You could probably put Angela Merkel, our own still reigning chancellor, in the same category, who choose to exert female power within a patriarchal framework still. And I was wondering, I was quite interested in if you see these kinds of new female leaders that we see emerging, like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. There's like this Finnish trio of governing ladies in a coalition. And also maybe a future president, Ocasio-Cortez in the US. Do you see them as exerting power in a different framework? Or is that still something that will limit them probably for the foreseeable future?
I mean, that's a brilliant question. And I think really we have to move at some point. We have to really move beyond individuals and start thinking about system, or at least take a critical look when we're talking about individuals and ask how it means to operate within a system. What limitations does that system actually have? And let's use, although this is more a reflection of race rather than gender, but let's use Barack Obama as an example. When Barack Obama came into presidency in 2008, I think it was, and he served 2 terms, and it was, seeing for the first time a black man, a black person as president of the United States. But everyone thought that was going to represent immediate change. And obviously he did have a significant impact. However, if we look at the United States as an imperial force, as a hierarchical force of Western and global capitalism and a global power, whether that's its military or its navy and so forth, and geopolitics, the United States continue to operate in the same way that the United States does, regardless of the race of the president. And I think that we have to look at things critically in terms of like the structures. So we know that, for instance, Bell Hooks coins this term, white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy, in that these are the dominant hierarchical systems that shape the world that we live in, right? And so you could have a leader who represents every marginalized group in the world, right? All in one person. But if they're operating within these structures and they're operating in a way that serves these structures, then we're not going to have any progress. So my thing is, how do we move to a position where we decolonize, where we shift away from these structures to more egalitarian structures, so we don't have to focus so much on there being a person of a particular identity, but more so us believing in the values of this person, you know, and the human values of this person and the way that they serve local communities and underprivileged groups. Like, for me, that's what I really at my core want to see, because let's say, for instance, in the UK, we haven't had a first you know, person of color or a black person as the prime minister in the UK. If we have someone who comes from that underprivileged background, but they're just reinforcing the same hierarchical powers of capitalism and imperialism and UK Brexit nationalism, then that's not going to be progress, you know? And so I think we have to also look at things critically and say, okay, but how is this shifting the way that these structures operate? How are we serving the most underprivileged in our communities? And for me, I would say that the best way for us to be able to analyze or evaluate how someone is doing in a position of leadership is look at how they support or treat the most disempowered in their society.
That's such a good point. And still, yeah, the UK is probably going to get there 20 years before Germany ever does. But
yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
Take that as a private comment. So I'm gonna try to screen share the video that the United Welsh College students have prepared. It's only 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes of it. You can see the whole show on YouTube. But I want to share a little bit of that, and then I'm going to introduce you to the next panel for the second half of this. And please be patient with me for the screen share, because that is always a little bit tricky, but I'm going to do my best now.
My perception of masculinity has changed after coming to an international school.
So my perception about masculinity has changed ever since I'm here, because back home there's a toxic environment in which how there's this like established stereotypes about how every single male should behave. And because of that, I decided that ever since I've been learning not only from what is established as the authoritarian figures, such as, for example, males and the teachers, but I decided, you know, to learn from how we can, I don't know, adapt ourselves. And, you know, things such as crying, embracing ourselves, and improving our emotions is really important. So that's what I think it has changed a lot ever since I'm here, because I wasn't used to things like this before.
I have been told to man up when I've shown vulnerability.
A lot of time in my life, I've been told to man up when I showed vulnerability, or I showed things that men, as perceived in society, are not supposed to show. And it's kind of like destroyed some parts of my identity, because I didn't want to like be different. But I understood that these weaknesses, as society perceived me, are my strength.
The phrase "men are trash" is a personal attack to all men and not patriarchy.
I think the phrase all men are trash is quite a generalization. I think there's other verbal ways to combat the patriarchy. You can say, I hate the patriarchy, and that's fine. But if you say men are trash, I don't see how that reflects on the patriarchy, but it's more an attack on even being a man.
As someone who dates men are trash. But I see it not as a personal attack, especially when it's not something political, and I don't think through this type of phrases, masculine bodies will be oppressed, but rather it's just a form of expression against the patriarchy, not just a single man. I don't feel personally affected nor oppressed by such a statement.
I feel
So that was basically just a little teaser of that. which the teacher who taught this class on your book has pointed me to, and everybody is very much invited to check this out and more content like this on United World College's social media. And with that, I'm going to hand over the moderation. I'm going to say goodbye in the end, but I want to introduce you to Marie, Helen, and Louise, who are already on screen, and I'm going to pin them and depin myself, and then they are going to take over from me. So.
Hello. I'm Maria, and thank you so much for this opportunity. It's very interesting to hear the questions and the answers. And I was wondering, you have a chapter in your book about feminism, and in there you mention self-identified feminists when you refer to some men who are feminists. And I was wondering, if I understand correctly, that implies that there is a certain authority that tells people whether they have the right or not to identify as feminists. And I was wondering, if that's the case, who do you think is this authority who gives the right to identify as feminist?
Wow, that's a powerful question. This is the thing, right? I think in terms of, especially in terms of feminism, and I want to say this in quite tentatively, obviously, as a man, there's only really so much that I can say, but I think when I speak about feminism, I speak about it more so in terms of like its intention and its impact as well, right? And so in terms of like identifying as a feminist and who can and who cannot, obviously that's a very nuanced kind of question, and different people will respond differently, particularly as to whether or not a man can or cannot identify as a feminist. And I think that's an in-group thing. And personally, I feel like as a movement that was started by women and initially for women, really, you know, that's women's prerogative to decide that. But I feel like as men, I think that we really have to understand that feminism has done more for us than any other movement that we've even created. You know, feminism has also benefited us in terms of liberating us as men from patriarchal toxic masculinity than anything else. And so my thing is rather than, for the men particularly who read about these issues, rather than jumping onto us identifying individually as feminists and then going into feminist spaces and taking up space there, let's go into the spaces that we occupy as men. Let's go back into the trenches of patriarchy and toxic masculinity and bring feminist discourse there. Let's go into the locker rooms, you know, let's go into the gyms, let's go into the bars and all of these places where we know that like groups of guys hang out. When we're hanging out amongst our group of guys as friends, like let's bring this kind of conversation into those spaces, because I think it doesn't really serve anyone to say like, okay, I know about feminism, you know, I'm okay, whatever, but because it's not having an impact if you do it on an individual level. I think it's about how you impact the people around you, particularly as men, the guys around you. And I think that is the crucial aspect that has a greater impact than whether or not you identify yourself as feminist. And unfortunately, we've seen loads of examples. And I don't need to name specifically any names, because I don't think the point here is to call anyone out. But we've seen many examples of guys, particularly male kind of public figures, who have identified as feminists and have really been outspoken, but then behind closed doors have turned out to be abusers and so forth. And that's always incredibly like discouraging and disappointing. So I think rather than focusing on individual figures and wherever they may or may not lie in terms of feminism, let's actually talk about the impact that they are having within those toxic male spaces where the biggest change needs to happen.
Thank you. Great, thank you. I have another question, which would be like, in your book, you said that there's definitely a difference between being masculine and being a man. And like, how would you define then being a man now? Like when masculinity can be such a like toxic thing and such a hurting thing, even to men that they suffer under, how would you then like see being a man?
I mean, that's a great question. I see being a man as something that's fluid and, you know, it doesn't have borders, right? And masculinity also is, at least for me, something that doesn't have borders. And I think that what I try to do in the way that I see myself and my identity is to try to imagine myself without limitations, you know, in terms of my identities, whether it's in terms of racial identity or gender identity or sexuality and so forth, because these are often constructs that kind of move from time to time. You know, if I think about my racial identity as a Black person, the way that I am Black or racialized as Black in the UK versus the way that I am Black or in the Congo are two different ways of like being Black, right? So when I'm in Congo, I don't even realize that I'm Black. I know I'm Black, but I don't have to think about being Black, you know? But when I'm in the UK and I step out, I know that I have to think about it. I know that I have to be more aware about how I am treated and how others might treat me. I know I need to be more aware when I'm in certain spaces, when I'm shopping, when I'm talking to people, etc., etc. And so I think that in terms of like that is, I try not to think of things in terms of like borders. You know, as much as like I really don't believe in borders, I believe more so in fluidity. And I think that as human beings, we have evolved the level of intelligence and consciousness that we can think of ourselves a little bit more openly and fluidly, I think. Hopefully, anyway. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. You got some brilliant questions here. Like.
Thank you. One thing that really interested me was when I read your book, like the structure of the text itself, it wasn't like very much like just your own words, but you had like statements in there from other people, and you always just introduced them by their first name, and I thought that was brilliant. But I wanted to ask who those people are, like who was it?
So I say at the end of the book, I've at least in the English version, so I hope it was included in the German version. So in the UK, there's a theatre called the Young Vic, which is a really popular theatre in London. And I did a project with them called the 8 Club, where they basically got a group of 8 guys, all different backgrounds in terms of race, sexuality, etc., and how they identify in terms of gender. They got us all together and to discuss everything to do with masculinity. And so the quotes that you see are in the book, they're from that show. And so the show is online, it's called the 8 Club. So I think if I tweeted it maybe like yesterday or the day before, so I can tweet it again, but I think it's a 4-episode show where we discuss basically everything to do with masculinity. And I'll say the interesting thing about filming that show is there was maybe about 10 of us or 12 of us all together. We were all strangers at the beginning. And when we first started, we were quite nervous around each other and no one really felt comfortable talking. By the end of it, guys were hugging each other. There were people crying, like guys were crying. They were sharing their deepest emotional thoughts. And one of the things that was very common was how everyone said that they had conversations here with strangers that they didn't feel comfortable having with the men in their everyday life. And I think that says a lot.
Okay, so I also have a question, and living here at RBC, an international boarding school, means that students have different backgrounds, they have different nationalities, and they grew up with a different culture and different languages. But what I was wondering is, to what extent having different nationalities and national identities, just as the students here at RBC do, enables someone to have a more open view on diverse masculinity.
You know, I think it's really important to be able to, I think if you have the opportunity to engage with and communicate with people of different backgrounds, nationalities, races, sexualities, etc., all of that, and you have the opportunity to really sit down and engage and learn with each other, I think that's a real privilege. And that's often something that people don't realize or take advantage of. And I think that, I mean, I didn't go to an international school by any stretch of the imagination, but one thing that I was always raised with growing up is my parents always said, you know, speak to everyone, right? Treat everyone the same and speak to everyone. And so whenever I spoke with people, no matter where they were from, no matter what their backgrounds were, I realized that I was learning as much from them as they were learning from me. It was a kind of mutual exchange. And then it made me also realize that, you know, life is a lottery. Like, none of us made a choice about, we didn't make a choice about being born, firstly, right? Like, it's like suddenly you're here and you're like, what in the world? Okay, you know, you have to try and adapt. And then secondly, none of us made a choice about the bodies that we're born into and how those bodies are treated, and the families that we're born into and how we're treated within those families. A lot of these are very kind of random lottery luck inheritances. And so if you think about it in that aspect, that we really had no choice about when we were born and how we were born, what families and time and cultures we were born into, it really makes you realize that no matter what you believe to be absolutely true, you could have been born somewhere else at a completely different time that would have meant that your experience was fundamentally different and could have shifted the way you think completely. And so I think it's about us opening up our minds and connecting with each other and finding that when you remove all these ideas about borders and identities and nationalities and politics, and you connect to the core that is the human being, you realize that fundamentally we have largely the same things and the same desires that connect us. And those are, you know, desires to belong, to connect, to have meaning, and to have purpose and love and empathy. And all of these things, regardless of whatever our backgrounds are, these are actually things that bind us stronger than anything else in terms of nationality or masculinity or anything like that.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So, thing is, when you said like earlier that like within the system there's only some like tokenism, basically people like of color, people of different gender being in a higher position of like power, and that doesn't really solve the problem. Would you think that like if people fundamentally changed all their outlook, like if as a man, if I was like very deep into toxic masculinity and I changed myself, that would probably like benefit the system, right? But then like how, when you're so deep in it and like you use it as a defense mechanism, how do you even like get started? Like because I've seen people in my life who are very deep in this, and like I felt bad about it because I didn't like it, but I also saw that they were suffering from it. And like how could I possibly help them, or how could they possibly start even seeing that they're suffering from this?
That's a great question, man. You guys, wow, you made my job hard, you know. You want me to have an answer for that? Wow.
You don't have to. I was just interested.
I will try. No, I will try. You know what? I'm gonna be honest with you. You know, that's a great question in that not everyone is gonna see things at the same way that you see it and at the same time as well. So there are some people who are so deeply entrenched in, and say men in this example, who are so deeply entrenched in toxic masculinity, and perhaps also some women who are deeply entrenched in terms of internalized patriarchy and internalized toxic masculinity, right? That these conversations may be then it won't even be, they won't be able to take it in, right? Or they'll be so defensive about it and they'll push it away and so forth. But I think there's one of two things: is you have those conversations if you can, if it doesn't affect your well-being and your safety and so forth, because it is really difficult to have those conversations non-stop. But I think somehow, if you give it enough time and if you change the culture and the environment slowly that they're around, and if, you know, you try to influence the younger generation in a more positive way, that's when you'll start to see the change on a more long-term basis. And then you will hopefully get to a point where, like, you know, if it's the older generation and they're looking at us, like, they're looking at the way that we're changing things, and they're thinking, oh, actually, we need to learn from them. You know, so I think there's ways that we can shift perhaps the culture on a societal level, on a wider level, even if we can't shift it in an individual level. But you can only do what you can do. You know, honestly, like, you can only do what you can do. And I wouldn't say that, like, don't try to be a hero and save the whole world at once. You know, like, I mean, I would love to see it, but I think, you know, like, honestly, and I don't want to say this in a discouraging way, because I know what it means to be, I'm a little bit older than you guys. You know, I don't count myself as young, but, you know, I feel very old now. But, you know, I remember what it feels like to be youthful and to want to do everything instantly, straight away, right? And to be frustrated when things don't work out instantly in the way that you want it to. I think the main thing is for you to be able to take care of yourself and focus on your well-being and try to positively influence who you can, where you can, and be patient along the way. And hopefully what you'll find is they may not listen to you straight away, but give it 5 years, give it 10 years, give it 15 years, and then maybe the conversations will change. And, you know, I say that in terms of, like, my own friendship group as guys. Like, I've got a lot of guy friends who 10 years ago, they were like, JJ, you talk too much about this. JJ, man, just, you know. And then now they're like, no, that's really interesting, you know. Oh, you wrote a book. No, I'm going to read that book. And I'll you know, I'll give you an example, right? So where I grew up in London is a place called Camden. I don't know if you guys would have heard of it, but Camden Town. Amy Winehouse, the musician, she's from there. So we grew up in the same area. I didn't know her, but it's that area. Right? And so in that area is absolutely known for drugs, unfortunately. There's just, like, drugs everywhere. And there's a kid that, you know, I kind of grew up with, but we weren't really friends. But, you know, we see each other, we say hello, and then, you know, we just keep going. Unfortunately, that kid that I know, he sold drugs. Like, he sells drugs, you know. And we all know this because you just know the area, right? But it's an unspoken thing. A few weeks ago, when I was in the area seeing my parents, I saw the kid. He's grown up now. He's a grown man. He's probably in his 20s now. And I saw him, and we had a bit of a chat. You know, he said, "Oh, how are you doing? You know, you're all right. Yeah, you're all right." And then he stopped me and he said, "You write those books, don't you?" And I was like, "Yeah." I was surprised that he knew. And he said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Oh, you've got something about being a man." And he said, "Yeah." He said, "Yeah, I'm gonna read it. I'm gonna read it." And I was like, "What?" Wow. Because he was the last person who I would have expected to read a book like that, you know. And so even if it's not straight away, it might be 5 years, it might be 10 years, etc. But we are actually moving forwards. You know, even the conversation that we are having now in terms of this, and the books that are out now in terms of masculinity and so forth, is so much more than what was out there 5 years ago, and 10 years ago, and 20 years ago. And if you think gender inequality is bad now, just think about what it must have been like in a workplace for women 20 years ago. You know, like no maternity. Imagine having to go straight back to work after like a week or something, and no laws around that kind of protection. Little things like that, there's discrimination and so forth. So we are making progress, but I think that we have to also really be kind of like realistic, you know, and we want things to change, but we must also be patient and wise and take our time and take care of ourselves. Well, I think that's the most important thing, is like really take care of yourself, because this is a lifelong journey.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I can imagine that must have been very empowering.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised. I was like, wow, okay. So yeah, I was very happy to hear that. And I hopefully next time I see him, we'll get to have a real discussion.
That sounds cool. Okay, I think we only have time for one more question.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you ever thought of naming the book Masculinity, but mask with a C at the end, as in masculinity.
Yeah, so you know, it's really interesting because when we was coming up with the name, especially the translation, we thought of every possible variation you could have imagined. And you know, I think the book now has 5 translations, and each country or each language is translated to has a slightly different variation. So even mask off, mask with a C, we discussed that as well, mask with a C, masculinity and so forth. We wasn't too sure whether or not people would understand the association straight away. But I think the naming of it, you know, is really interesting, because in Germany it's don't be a man, but it's in Brazil it's be a man. So, you know, in each, and this is the thing, right? It's the same conversation, but in each culture, the slight shift in language, it evokes a particular idea in our consciousness. You know, we're talking about the same subjects, but we're just talking about different ways of imagining them. And I think as long as we get to the core of the issue, like I don't mind what we name it, but we have to just, as long as we understand, you know. So if you guys have got some creative ideas in terms of names or what you would have called it, maybe you might even write a book someday, you know, with your own creative name, and please do, like, that would be amazing to see, you know.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We're right on
Thank
time.
you guys. You guys are amazing.
Thank you for having us here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you to Marie-Helen and Louise for taking over from me for a good portion of this. As a millennial myself, I can say I'm happy to be upstaged by the next generation every chance I get. So that gives me hope for the future, I think. So everybody who wants to pose a question from the audience for like the last few minutes of this can now type them into the chat very quickly, or raise their hand even if they want to talk to JJ themselves. Okay, we have the first one already. Oh, and there's a, okay, so before we start this, we have a few minutes, not half an hour, so don't be mad at me. But I'm gonna give the word to Una Fonte.
Hi, my name is Una. I'm a student at Robert Bosch, and I'm from Vermont, which is in the US. My question booked with this a lot. And why? Because you already covered so much content. So, masculinity, the state of being masculinity, because your body physically is not going to do. Being physically disabled, your body is not going to live up to that standard of masculinity. So how do you think kind of this idea of fourth wave feminism, and just which incorporates the redefining of masculinity within this patriarchal framework, how do you think that applies to disability? Thank you.
I'm gonna, your audio was a little bit off sometimes, so I'm gonna try to answer it from what I heard, and I think you were talking about masculinity and disability and associations with and how it might apply.
Yes, I'm so sorry. My audio was poor. Yeah, basically, how do you think masculinity, feminism, and disability can relate? Right.
So this is the thing, particularly with disability, and you know, as we were talking earlier about masculinity being a performance, in the way that, and if we're thinking about the intersections of identity, and you know, myself writing this book, I very much recognize that I was writing it from the position of being a Black able-bodied man, in that if you're looking at the theory of disability, in that it's not, the burden isn't on the person, the burden is on society to change so that it can incorporate and allow people who are differently able to be able to live in the fullness of their life. And I think in terms of like masculinity and performance, you know, being able to fit into a particular physical criteria is also kind of a requirement of that masculinity. And so if you look at how that's expressed in the mainstream as well, we don't really get to see perhaps representations of differently abled bodies, and particularly in masculinity. You know, a lot of the men that we see in the mainstream are very kind of physically athletic, and that's the expectation, you know. And so I think that if I were to be differently abled, or whatever other intersection of identity that perhaps I would have definitely influenced the way that I would have seen my own masculinity and the way that I would have been treated in the world. And so for me, that's why I kind of like in the book, I very much state the position that I'm writing from. And I know that there are limitations with that. Like I'm a straight man, so I know that I can't write about what it means to be queer or what it means to be gay alongside of my masculine identity, because those aren't spaces that I've had to navigate. However, one thing I do absolutely encourage is to uplift voices and writers from other groups, from other intersections of masculinity and so forth. Like there's a book that's coming out by Martin Robinson, who's a UK, like a white British writer. And he talks about writing about, you know, toxic masculinity from a white British male perspective, which is very different to my Black African perspective as a man. But those voices are also important. And so I think it's about, hopefully, the bigger that this trend gets, in terms of talking about masculinity, the more that we'll see a wide variation of voices that are talking about issues such as disability, such as perhaps being neurodivergent. What does it mean to live with masculinity and a mental illness? What does it mean for perhaps masculinity and sexuality and so forth, and transgender issues and so forth? And so I think kind of absolutely recognize the limitations of what we can and cannot write about just by virtue of the bodies that we exist in. So yeah, it's about lifting as many voices as possible and having a wider collective understanding of these issues. Hopefully that's answered your question.
So there's another question in the chat by Paul Gabriel. I have a feeling he's a WC student as well, but I'm not sure. But the question is excellent. Many tout self-care as a radical form of resistance against oppression of bodies, typically work and labor. How can this apply to resisting masculinity? Does this help address, systemic gender inequalities too? Or perhaps deconstructing what Carol Pateman calls the sexual contract, where the boys decide the systems like the founding fathers, thus subjecting women? Wow, that's a dissertation right there.
So self-care is a radical form of resistance, and in terms of resisting masculinity. So I think in terms of toxic masculinity particularly, I think that we have to first, when we talk about self-care, we have to first be aware of the reasons why we have to take care of ourselves. And largely the reasons are because our bodies are exploited, our labor is exploited, and the fact that our well-being and our kind of social consciousness is socialized in a way that's harmful and destructive to our own sense of self as well. So when we're talking about toxic masculinity particularly, we understand that as men, we are socialized to be violent, to be aggressive, and that is not our nature. So I largely think that when we talk about self-care, although self-care I feel like has been appropriated and is now kind of something that's been marketed as very Instagrammy and fashionable and all of this like, oh, nice, ha, ha, ha stuff. But actually, when I think about self-care, I think about it in the sense of like the radical unlearning of the way that society and the hierarchies and structure of the society has socialized us to invest in it. So it's like, how do you radically divest from, you know, these hierarchies and these structures? And so if I look at an example of toxic masculinity, what is the most destructive thing that we've been socialized into is violence and aggression. So if my sense of self-care, what do I do for that is to remove myself from that. So I do that by actively showing compassion, actively showing love, actively practicing peace. And that's what, for me, that's the way that I see radical self-care, is the radical disinvestment from the privileges and the hierarchies that socialize us as human beings. And I think that, you know, everyone will have their definition of what that looks like, but the more that you can do to pull out of this system, to abandon your privilege, the better that it's going to be for you and the people around you and society in the long run. So as men, like, what can we do to give up our privileges? You know, what do we do to actively, like, how do we actively support the movement of gender equality? And if it's actively, for me, I think one of the biggest things that we can do as men individually and in our circles is to actively resist socialization of violence and aggression that is normalized in our everyday lives. The majority of violent crimes that are committed are by men. Over 80–90% of violent crimes are committed by men. Men are the most likely to be victims of violent crime. So we are harmful towards others, and we're harmful also to ourselves as well. And so if we want a peaceful world, we have to, as men, self-care means being more peaceful. It means being less violent and less aggressive.
So Paul informs us, actually he's an alum, so I wasn't far off. And I think, like, the last question probably to close this section off before we say goodbye is from Maggie, Tosca, and Zuja. And it's like the biggest question of them all. Why do you feel like this book is important and needed to be written?
Ooh, that is a really, really good question. You know, for me, writing this book, especially when, you know, when I first sat down with the idea and when I was in the process of writing this book, I had no idea that it was going to be translated in as many languages that it has been now. I had no idea that it would receive as much interest as it did now. It's something that, I mean, this subject is something that I've written about in many different forms. You know, I started off writing poetry, and I have a poem, I think it's still on YouTube, called Real Men, which talks about this issue. And that came out a long time ago. And you'll see that the quality of the camera is really bad. So you'll see how old that video is. And I had a little blog years ago that I would write about these issues and just kind of discuss and share. But I think for me, one of the reasons why I was motivated to write about this subject was because I wanted a book that I could give to the 13-year-old me when I was going through certain things. Like, there are things in my life that I really struggled with, that if I just had someone to have that conversation with me, that I would have been able to find a solution for those struggles a lot easier. And then I was thinking about, well, there are 13-year-olds, 14-year-old boys, girls, etc., who are struggling with the same issues. There are also older men who are struggling with the same issues. So how can I write this book in a way that connects and engages with people? And so I think that, you know, in writing these stories, it helps us to connect with each other. We can sit all day and talk about statistics, but really we're moved by the narratives that we hear and the way that we connect with people. And I think that's the thing that really shifts our understanding and our perception and our behaviors in the world. And so I wanted to write this book to really connect with people, to really, you know, put a message out there, but also to learn as well and see how I can improve. And I feel incredibly privileged for it to reach this level, because I'm telling you, I never imagined it. And so even just like, for example, when my publisher told me, when my agent told me that, you know, we've got a publisher in Germany who wants to, really excited about the book, I was like, what? Germany? I mean, I speak French, right? So I always imagined that the first translation would be French. But when they said Germany, I was like, wow, people in Germany are interested to read my book? And I was like, hey, okay, I'm not going to say no, right? So I literally thought that the book would get translated and, you know, nothing much would happen. I did not think that it would reach this conversation and so many people were interested in it having this kind of impact. And one of the things that's really encouraging for me is that I hope that it's going to encourage young people and older people and people from different backgrounds to be able to write their own stories in their own ways and bring out as many stories that are challenging the way we think and moving us forwards as well. And I think someone said, why not? Why didn't I think that it would be popular? See, I know, like, for me, I know that the Germans have a reputation of being incredibly efficient and intelligent, and I absolutely knew that. So I've been to kind of Berlin book fairs a few years ago, like a lot of times, and they're always very invigorating discussions. But one thing you have to understand, when you're a writer, you don't really believe that your book is going to connect with anyone, you know? And I think that was the main thing. And especially when it's in a different country to the one that you grew up in or the one that you know. So, you know, it's just like more so me saying that I feel very lucky that this conversation is having an impact and that it's encouraging both young people, but also older people as well. And I think one of the most, I'll just kind of end with this, one of the most encouraging messages that I received was from this man, a German man, sent me a message saying, I just read your book, and, you know, I'm a middle-class white German man in my 50s, and, you know, we have completely different life experiences, but I connect with you and this book as if you wrote my own life story. And I was like, wow, you know, that just shows just how, like, no matter what identities or things that we think separate us, we're a lot closer than we realize, and that our stories can impact each other in ways that we maybe don't even realize, you know, we don't even know. So
I think that's about the best note to end on that one can find, actually. Before I say my final thank you and goodbyes for Carl-Schurz-Haus and for myself, let me put in a very short section in German, just 1 minute basically. Ich möchte Sie kurz noch darauf hinweisen, wer jetzt noch da ist. Es ist ja noch eine ganz beträchtliche Anzahl, dass unsere Transatlantic Tuesday-Reihe weitergeht. Immer am Dienstag, im März und April haben wir einen großen Namen da, auch wieder zum Online-Gespräch. Die nächsten Wochen sind das Elmar Thewissen, der Studioleiter des ZDF in Washington, der über die neue Regierung spricht in den USA. Julia Phillips, Finalistin für den National Book Award, die einen wunderbaren Roman geschrieben hat, Disappearing Earth, und bei uns sein wird. Und die Pulitzer-Preisgewinnerin Anne Applebaum ist dann in 3 Wochen dabei. Kurz möchte ich auch noch darauf hinweisen, besonders für die United World College Students, die noch hier sind. Wir haben eine Lesegruppe für längere amerikanische Magazinstücke im Carl-Schurz-Haus, die Long Reads Loyalists, bei denen ich auch beteiligt bin. Da hatten wir immer schon Schülerinnen und Schüler von euch dabei. Wenn ihr Lust habt, kommt wieder dazu. Momentan auch online natürlich. Am 18. März geht es um den langen Abschied der USA aus Afghanistan mit einem Stück aus dem New Yorker. Genau, und zuletzt, wer noch da ist und kein Minderjähriger ist, darf sich gerne mit einem Unkostenbeitrag an der Veranstaltung beteiligen, wenn es Ihnen gefallen hat. Die Spendenkontodaten und so weiter finden Sie in der E-Mail mit der Bestätigung, damit wir das kulturelle Leben auch in Pandemiezeiten ein bisschen am Leben halten können. So, back to English for a last hurrah, basically. I want to first thank Marie-Helen Louise for moderating expertly, for posing the best questions that one cannot always ask in like the corset of a traditional moderation, where you have to like, get to the book and get to several points, and you just freestyled all the way through. I loved it. I always love when you guys take part in an event of ours. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much to Lydia White, who was a really, really great help in bringing this together, in thinking this through and making it happen in this way, and to her colleague Christian Bock, and to United World College as a whole, of course, in Freiburg, always a great place to visit. We love being there. I love the sheep. And thank you to Hansa Blau, to the publisher of JJ Bola in German. They do great books, start important conversations that other publishers probably wouldn't. And last but not least, but most, I think, thank you, JJ Bola, for being with us tonight. It's been a blast. I think we all learned a lot.
Thank you very much. I feel very, very privileged. And thank you to you, Renee, and also to students and everyone who you mentioned. I feel so very privileged to have this conversation in general, but also to have it on a Friday evening is just even more important. So yeah, thank you all.
It's true. All right. See you, everybody. Good night.
Bye.